Lieutenant Commander David Thompson was having a good day. He had just finished a weekend training session at the Naval Reserve Center in Atlanta, and his mind was still buzzing with the satisfaction that came from a job well done. The exercises had gone smoothly, and his team had performed better than expected. As he drove his black SUV through the quiet streets of downtown Atlanta, he was already thinking about the week ahead and the reports he needed to file. David wasn't the kind of man who drew attention to himself. At 34, he had spent 12 years in the Navy, working his way up through the ranks with dedication and discipline. His friends often joked that he was too serious, but David knew that his careful nature had kept him and his teammates alive during multiple tours overseas. Today, he was dressed casually in jeans and a simple polo shirt, looking like any other weekend warrior heading home after some time at the gym. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the road when David noticed the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. He glanced down at his speedometer and frowned. He was doing exactly 35 in a 35 zone, just as he always did. His military training had made him precise about following rules, whether they were rules of engagement or simple traffic laws. David pulled over carefully, using his turn signal and checking his mirrors twice before coming to a complete stop. He rolled down his window and placed both hands on the steering wheel, just as he had been taught. These were dangerous times for everyone, and he wanted to make sure there were no misunderstandings. Officer Rick Morrison approached the vehicle with a swagger that David recognized immediately. He had seen that walk before, usually on men who had something to prove. Morrison was a big man, probably in his early 40s, with graying hair and the kind of mustache that belonged in an old Western movie. His uniform was crisp and his badge gleamed in the afternoon light. "License and registration," Morrison said without any greeting. His voice was flat, almost bored, as if this was just another routine stop in a long day of routine stops. David reached slowly for his wallet, announcing each movement as he made it. "I'm reaching for my license now, officer. It's in my wallet in my back pocket." He had learned long ago that clear communication could prevent a lot of problems. As he handed over his driver's license, David also pulled out his military identification card. "Here's my license, and this is my military ID as well." Morrison barely glanced at the military ID before handing it back. His attention was focused entirely on the driver's license, and David could see him studying the address, the photo, and every detail printed on the plastic card. "Do you know why I stopped you today?" Morrison asked, still not making eye contact. David was genuinely puzzled. "No, sir, I don't. I was driving the speed limit and following all traffic laws as far as I know." Morrison's expression didn't change. "I clocked you doing 45 in a 35 zone. You were also weaving between lanes without signaling." David felt his stomach drop. He knew for certain that neither of those things was true. His speedometer had never gone above 35, and he hadn't changed lanes once since leaving the Naval Center. But he also knew that arguing with a police officer on the side of the road rarely ended well for anyone. "I respectfully disagree, officer, but I'm happy to accept whatever citation you feel is appropriate," David said carefully. Morrison's eyes narrowed at this response. "Step out of the vehicle, please." David's heart rate increased slightly, but he complied without question. As he stood beside his SUV, he noticed Morrison looking over the vehicle with obvious interest. The SUV was nice, maybe nicer than what most people would expect a mid-level military officer to drive. But David had saved carefully for years to buy it. "This is an expensive truck," Morrison commented, walking around the vehicle slowly. "What do you do for work?" "I'm a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy," David replied. "I serve at the Reserve Center here in Atlanta." Morrison nodded absently, but David could tell the officer wasn't really listening. Instead, Morrison seemed to be looking for something, though David couldn't imagine what. "I'm going to need to search your vehicle," Morrison announced suddenly. David felt a chill run down his spine. "May I ask why?" "I haven't given you any reason to believe there's anything illegal in my car." "I smell marijuana," Morrison said flatly. "That gives me probable cause to search." David knew this was a lie. He had never used drugs in his life, and nobody had been smoking anything in or around his vehicle. His car smelled like leather cleaner and the pine air freshener hanging from his rearview mirror. But he also knew that challenging the officer's claims would only make things worse. "I don't consent to a search, but I won't physically resist if you insist on searching," David said. Pulling out his phone, Morrison immediately stepped closer. "Put that phone away." "I'm allowed to record this interaction," David said calmly. "It's my right as a citizen." "Not while I'm conducting an investigation," Morrison shot back. "Put the phone away or I'll arrest you for interfering with police business." David reluctantly put his phone back in his pocket, but not before he had managed to start recording. The phone continued to capture audio from his pocket as Morrison began searching through his vehicle. For 20 minutes, Morrison went through every inch of David's SUV. He checked under the seats, in the glove compartment, and even pulled up the floor mats. He found nothing because there was nothing to find. David's car contained exactly what anyone would expect: registration and insurance papers, a phone charger, some workout clothes in the back seat, and a half-empty bottle of water. When the search turned up nothing, Morrison's demeanor became even more hostile. He returned to David with a citation book in his hand and began writing furiously. "I'm citing you for reckless driving, failure to signal, and resisting arrest," Morrison announced as he tore off multiple tickets. "Resisting arrest?" David asked in disbelief. "I haven't resisted anything. I've been completely cooperative. You question my authority and refuse to cooperate with my investigation," Morrison replied coldly. David took the tickets with a feeling of unreality washing over him. In 12 years of military service, including multiple combat deployments, he had never been in trouble with the law. His record was spotless, his conduct exemplary, and his service to his country beyond question. Yet here he stood on a quiet Atlanta street, holding citations for crimes he knew he hadn't committed. As Morrison returned to his patrol car, David sat in his SUV for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. The tickets in his hand represented more than just fines. They could affect his security clearance, his military career, and his ability to serve his country. The injustice of it burned in his chest, but his training kept him calm. David started his engine and pulled back onto the road, driving exactly the speed limit toward home. In his rearview mirror, he could see Morrison's patrol car following him for several blocks before finally turning off. As he drove, David made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't going to let this injustice stand unchallenged. He had spent his career defending justice and freedom around the world. Now it was time to defend those same principles right here at home. Officer Rick Morrison sat in his patrol car for nearly an hour after the traffic stop, staring at the blank incident report on his computer screen. The cursor blinked steadily, waiting for him to begin typing, but Morrison was carefully thinking through every word he was about to write. This report would become the official record of what happened, and Morrison knew it needed to tell the right story. Morrison had been a police officer for 18 years, and he understood how the system worked. He knew that judges and prosecutors rarely questioned the word of a sworn officer, especially when that officer had years of experience and a clean record. He also knew that his version of events would carry far more weight than anything a defendant might claim in court. The truth was that Morrison hadn't liked David Thompson from the moment he saw him. Driving that expensive SUV through downtown Atlanta, Morrison lived paycheck to paycheck, struggling to make ends meet on a police officer's salary, and it irritated him to see young black men driving vehicles he could never afford. In Morrison's mind, there were only a few ways someone like Thompson could afford a truck like that, and none of them were legitimate. Morrison began typing his report, carefully crafting each sentence to build a case that would be difficult to challenge. He wrote that he had observed the suspect vehicle traveling at approximately 45 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone. He noted that the vehicle had made several lane changes without proper signaling and that the driver appeared to be driving erratically. But Morrison didn't stop there. He knew that traffic violations alone wouldn't justify the extensive search he had conducted, so he added details that would provide the necessary probable cause. He wrote that upon approaching the vehicle, he had detected a strong odor of marijuana emanating from the interior. He described the driver as nervous and evasive when questioned about his activities. Morrison paused in his typing, remembering Thompson's calm demeanor and respectful responses. The man had been nothing but polite and cooperative throughout the entire encounter. But Morrison pushed those thoughts aside and continued writing his fictional account. He described Thompson as initially refusing to provide identification and becoming increasingly agitated when asked routine questions. Morrison wrote that the suspect had made several threatening gestures and had attempted to use his cell phone to possibly alert associates, despite being ordered to put the device away. According to Morrison's report, Thompson had only complied with orders after being threatened with arrest. The search of the vehicle, Morrison wrote, was conducted due to the strong marijuana odor and the suspect's suspicious behavior. He noted that while no contraband was found, this did not diminish the probable cause that had justified the search in the first place. Morrison saved the most creative part for last. He wrote that Thompson matched the general description of a suspect in several recent break-ins in the area. Morrison knew this was completely fabricated, but he also knew that it would be nearly impossible to disprove. The description he provided was intentionally vague, mentioning only that the suspect was a black male in his 30s driving a dark-colored SUV. As Morrison finished typing his report, his partner for the day, Officer Lisa Chen, approached his patrol car. Chen was a relatively new officer, only 3 years on the force, but she was sharp and observant. Morrison had noticed her watching the traffic stop from their secondary position down the street. That seemed like a long stop for a simple traffic violation, Chen commented as she leaned against Morrison's car. Morrison looked up from his computer screen. The guy was acting suspicious. Had to do a vehicle search. Chen frowned slightly. I didn't see any erratic driving when we were following him. He seemed to be staying right at the speed limit. Morrison's jaw tightened. Are you questioning my judgment, Chen? No, Chen started, then stopped herself. She was still new enough to the force that she didn't want to make waves with a senior officer. I just want to make sure I understand what happened in case I need to back up your report. Morrison turned back to his computer. The guy was speeding and driving recklessly. When I stopped him, he got aggressive and tried to interfere with my investigation. I smelled drugs in the car, so I searched it. That's what's in my report, and that's what happened. Chen nodded slowly, but Morrison could see the doubt in her eyes. She had been close enough to observe most of the interaction, and Morrison knew she had seen Thompson's respectful behavior and cooperative attitude. But Chen was also smart enough to know that challenging a senior officer's account could be career suicide. Did you find anything in the search? Chen asked. No, but that doesn't mean there wasn't anything there earlier, Morrison replied. These guys are smart. They know how to hide things. Chen walked away without saying anything else, but Morrison could tell she wasn't satisfied with his explanation. He made a mental note to be more careful around her in the future. The last thing he needed was a partner who asked too many questions. Morrison submitted his report and began thinking about the court date that would inevitably follow. Thompson would probably try to fight the charges, but Morrison wasn't worried. He had been testifying in court for years, and he knew how to present himself as a credible witness. Judges and juries trusted police officers, and Morrison had never had his word seriously challenged. What Morrison didn't know was that Thompson wasn't just any citizen. He wasn't some young man who could be intimidated into accepting a plea deal or paying fines for crimes he didn't commit. Thompson was a decorated military officer with 12 years of experience dealing with life and death situations. He was trained to stay calm under pressure, to analyze threats carefully, and to fight back when necessary. Morrison also didn't realize that Thompson had managed to record part of their interaction, despite his orders to put the phone away. The audio recording would contradict several key points in Morrison's fabricated report, though Thompson wouldn't discover this until later. As Morrison finished his shift that evening, he felt satisfied with how he had handled the situation. In his mind, he had taken a potentially dangerous criminal off the streets, even if he hadn't been able to find direct evidence of wrongdoing. He believed he was doing his job the way it was supposed to be done, but Morrison had made a critical error in judgment. He had assumed that Thompson would be just another victim of the system, someone who would quietly accept whatever punishment was handed down, rather than fight back. Morrison had no idea that he had just made an enemy of someone with the skills, resources, and determination to expose the truth. The false report Morrison had filed would soon become the foundation of his own downfall. Every lie he had written, every detail he had fabricated, would eventually be used against him in a court of law. Justice would come, but not in the way Morrison expected. Thompson, meanwhile, was already preparing for battle. He had copies of the citations, and he was carefully documenting everything he could remember about the encounter. He had served his country with honor in some of the most dangerous places on earth, And he wasn't about to let a corrupt police officer destroy everything he had worked for. The war between truth and lies was about to begin, and Morrison had no idea what he was up against. The Atlanta Municipal Court was packed on Tuesday morning when David Thompson walked through the heavy wooden doors. He had chosen to wear his navy dress blues for this appearance, the dark blue uniform crisp and perfect, with his ribbons and insignia telling the story of 12 years of dedicated service. The uniform drew stares from other defendants and court staff, but David kept his eyes focused straight ahead as he made his way to the defendant's table. David's attorney, Robert Hayes, was already waiting for him. Hayes was a former military man himself, having served in the Army before going to law school, and he understood exactly why David had chosen to wear his uniform to court. They had spent hours preparing for this day, going over David's version of events and discussing strategy. "You ready for this?" Hayes asked quietly as David took his seat. David nodded. "I've been ready since the day it happened." The courtroom was typical for a municipal court, with fluorescent lights that cast a harsh glare over everything and the kind of furniture that looked like it had been purchased sometime in the 1980s. Judge Patricia Williams presided over the proceedings with the efficiency of someone who had seen thousands of similar cases over the years. She was a fair judge, known for listening carefully to both sides before making her decisions. When David's case was called, Officer Morrison took the witness stand first. Morrison had also dressed carefully for the occasion, wearing his dress uniform with all of his commendations and service ribbons on display. He looked every inch the professional police officer as he raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor, a young assistant district attorney named Kevin Baker, began his questioning with the standard routine. Morrison stated his name, his years of service, and his experience as a traffic enforcement officer. He spoke confidently, making eye contact with the judge and presenting himself as a credible witness. "Officer Morrison, can you tell the court what happened on the afternoon in question?" Baker asked. Morrison leaned slightly toward the microphone. "Your Honor, I was conducting routine patrol in downtown Atlanta when I observed a black SUV traveling at a high rate of speed. I used my radar gun to clock the vehicle at 45 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone." David felt his jaw clench as he listened to Morrison's testimony. He knew for certain that he had never exceeded the speed limit, but Morrison continued his fabricated account with the confidence of someone telling the absolute truth. The vehicle was also making erratic lane changes without proper signaling. Morrison continued. "Based on these traffic violations, I initiated a traffic stop." Judge Williams made notes as Morrison spoke, occasionally looking up to study his demeanor. Morrison had testified in her courtroom many times over the years, and she knew him to be a generally reliable witness. Morrison went on to describe his version of the encounter with David. According to his testimony, David had been immediately hostile and uncooperative. Morrison claimed that David had initially refused to provide identification and had become increasingly agitated when asked routine questions. The defendant seemed nervous and kept looking around as if he was expecting someone or something, Morrison testified. "When I asked him to step out of the vehicle, he became verbally aggressive and started making threats." David's attorney made careful notes of every lie Morrison told. Hayes had advised David to remain calm and let Morrison dig his own grave with false testimony that could later be contradicted. Morrison then described detecting the odor of marijuana coming from David's vehicle, which he claimed had given him probable cause to conduct a search. He testified that David had attempted to use his cell phone during the stop, possibly to alert associates, and had only complied with orders after being threatened with arrest. "I conducted a thorough search of the vehicle," Morrison continued, "but was unable to locate any contraband. However, the defendant's behavior and the strong odor of marijuana justified the search under department policy." When the prosecutor finished his questioning, it was Hayes' turn to cross-examine Morrison. Hayes stood slowly looking down at his notes before making eye contact with the officer. "Officer Morrison, you testified that you clocked my client at 45 miles per hour, is that correct?" "Yes, sir. And you're certain of that speed?" "Absolutely. I've been using radar equipment for 15 years. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "You also testified that Mr. Thompson was making erratic lane changes. How many lane changes did you observe?" Morrison paused for just a moment. Several. 3 or 4 at least. And you're certain of that number? Yes, sir. Hayes made a note and continued. Officer Morrison, did you notice anything unusual about Mr. Thompson's appearance or demeanor when you first approached his vehicle? He seemed nervous and evasive, Morrison replied. Did you notice that he was wearing civilian clothes? Yes. Did you notice the military identification card that he presented to you along with his driver's license? Morrison shifted slightly in his seat. He may have shown me some kind of military ID, but I see a lot of fake identification in my line of work. Hayes raised an eyebrow. So you're testifying under oath that you believed Mr. Thompson's military identification might be fake? Morrison realized he had walked into a trap, but it was too late to back down. I've learned not to take anything at face value during a traffic stop. Hayes turned to look at David in his dress blues, then back at Morrison. Officer Morrison, does the defendant look familiar to you today? Morrison followed Hayes's gaze to David, seeing him clearly in his military uniform for the first time since the traffic stop. David sat perfectly straight, his uniform immaculate, his bearing unmistakably that of a career military officer. Morrison's expression flickered for just a moment as he realized who he was looking at. He looks like the person I stopped, Morrison said carefully. Nothing else strikes you about his appearance today? Morrison's discomfort was becoming more obvious. He's wearing a military uniform. That's correct. Mr. Thompson is a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy with 12 years of active service, including multiple combat deployments. Does that change your assessment of his character or credibility? The prosecutor objected that the question was argumentative, and Judge Williams sustained the objection. But the point had been made. Morrison was clearly realizing for the first time exactly who he had targeted with his false allegations. Hayes continued his cross-examination, systematically challenging each element of Morrison's testimony. He pointed out inconsistencies in the officer's account and asked detailed questions about department procedures for traffic stops and vehicle searches. Officer Morrison, you testified that you smelled marijuana in Mr. Thompson's vehicle. How strong was this odor? Very strong, Morrison replied, though his confidence was beginning to waver. Strong enough that other officers at the scene would have detected it? Morrison glanced toward the back of the courtroom where Officer Chen was sitting. Possibly. But you didn't call for backup or additional officers to assist with your investigation? It wasn't necessary, Hayes pressed on. Officer Morrison, in your 18 years of law enforcement, have you ever filed a false report? Objection, the prosecutor called out. Sustained, Judge Williams ruled. But again, the question had served its purpose. When Morrison finally stepped down from the witness stand, it was clear that his testimony had not gone as smoothly as he had expected. Hayes had not directly proven that Morrison was lying, but he had raised enough doubts to make the judge take notice. David then took the stand to tell his version of events. Speaking in the clear, measured tones that had served him well in military briefings, David described exactly what had happened during the traffic stop. He testified that he had never exceeded the speed limit, had not changed lanes without signaling, and had been completely cooperative throughout the encounter. I presented both my driver's license and my military identification to Officer Morrison, David testified. I remained respectful and followed all of his instructions, even when I disagreed with his assessment of my driving. David explained his military background and his spotless record of service. He described his training in high-stress situations and his commitment to following rules and procedures. The contrast between his testimony and Morrison's characterization of him as an aggressive, uncooperative suspect was stark. When the testimony was complete, Judge Williams took a brief recess to consider the evidence. David and his attorney waited in the hallway, both feeling cautiously optimistic about how the proceedings had gone. Morrison looked pretty uncomfortable up there, Hayes observed. David nodded. He didn't expect to be challenged. He thought this would be routine. When court reconvened, Judge Williams announced her decision. While she noted the inconsistencies in the testimony and her concerns about some aspects of the case, she ultimately ruled that she could not completely dismiss the charges based solely on conflicting testimony. However, she did reduce the charges significantly and imposed minimal fines. It wasn't the complete victory David had hoped for, but it was clear that Judge Williams had serious doubts about Morrison's version of events. As they left the courthouse, Hayes was already planning their next move. "This isn't over," Hayes told David. "Morrison's testimony today is going to come back to haunt him." David looked back at the courthouse, his jaw set with determination. He had spent his career fighting for justice around the world. Now the battle had come home and he was just getting started. 3 weeks after the court hearing, Robert Hayes sat in his law office staring at a computer screen that would change everything. The email had arrived that morning from the Atlanta Police Department's Legal Affairs Division, and attached to it was a file that Hayes had been fighting to obtain for months through the discovery process. The dashcam footage from Officer Morrison's patrol car was 23 minutes and 14 seconds long, and Hayes had watched it 7 times already. Each viewing made him angrier at what Morrison had done, and more confident that they now had the evidence they needed to destroy the officer's credibility completely. Hayes immediately called David Thompson. "You need to get down here right now," he said, "and bring some coffee. We're going to be here for a while." When David arrived an hour later, Hayes had already prepared a detailed analysis of the video footage. They sat together in the conference room and Hayes started the video from the beginning. "Watch carefully," Hayes said. "Notice how Morrison's own dashcam proves he was lying about almost everything." The video began with Morrison's patrol car following David's SUV for nearly 2 full minutes before initiating the traffic stop. During that entire time, David's vehicle maintained a steady speed that was clearly at or below the posted limit. The speedometer visible in Morrison's vehicle showed he was traveling at 35 miles per hour the entire time he was following David. "There's your speeding charge," Hayes said. "Morrison was doing exactly 35 while following your vehicle, which means you were doing 35 or less." The video also clearly showed that David had made no lane changes whatsoever during the time Morrison was following him. David's SUV stayed in the right lane the entire time, never deviating or making any erratic movements. When Morrison activated his emergency lights and pulled David over, the video captured the entire interaction. David immediately pulled over safely, using his turn signal and coming to a complete stop. When Morrison approached the vehicle, David's hands were clearly visible on the steering wheel. The audio quality was excellent, and every word of the conversation was audible. David's voice was calm and respectful throughout the encounter. He immediately provided both his driver's license and military identification, exactly as he had testified. Morrison barely looked at the military ID before handing it back. "Listen to this part," Hayes said, turning up the volume. On the recording, David could be heard asking politely why he had been stopped. Morrison's response was to accuse him of speeding and erratic driving. But even Morrison's tone suggested he wasn't entirely confident in his accusations. The most damning part of the video came when Morrison claimed to smell marijuana. The dashcam microphone was sensitive enough to pick up conversations happening near the vehicle, and Morrison could be heard muttering to himself as he walked around David's SUV. "I don't smell anything," Morrison's voice said quietly, apparently not realizing the microphone would pick up his words. "But I'm going to search this car anyway." Hayes paused the video at that moment. "There's your probable cause or lack thereof. Morrison just admitted on tape that he didn't smell marijuana, but he was going to search your vehicle anyway." The video continued to show David's completely cooperative behavior throughout the search. He stood quietly beside his vehicle, answering Morrison's questions politely and never making any threatening gestures or statements. When David pulled out his phone, the video clearly showed him announcing his intention to record the encounter, and Morrison immediately ordering him to put the device away. Morrison testified under oath that you were aggressive and threatening, Hayes said. "This video shows the exact opposite. You were a model citizen throughout the entire encounter." But Hayes had uncovered even more damaging evidence than just the dashcam footage. His investigation into Morrison's background had revealed a pattern of behavior that would shock anyone who believed in justice and fairness. Hayes spread a stack of documents across the conference table. "I've been digging into Morrison's history, and what I found is going to blow this case wide open." The documents showed that Morrison had been the subject of 17 complaints over the past 5 years, all involving allegations of racial profiling, excessive force, or false reporting. Most of these complaints had been dismissed by internal affairs without serious investigation, but the pattern was undeniable. "Look at this," Hayes said, pointing to a specific report. Last year, Morrison stopped a black college professor driving a Mercedes and charged him with the exact same violations he charged you with. The professor had a spotless driving record and was later completely exonerated when witnesses came forward. Hayes had found 6 similar cases where Morrison had targeted black men driving expensive vehicles. In each case, Morrison had filed reports alleging speeding, erratic driving, and suspicious behavior. In each case, the defendants had been professional men with clean records who insisted they had done nothing wrong. The pattern is so obvious it's almost unbelievable, Hayes continued. Morrison has been systematically targeting successful black men, probably because he can't stand to see them driving cars he can't afford. Hayes had also uncovered Morrison's financial troubles, which helped explain his motivation. Morrison was deeply in debt, behind on his mortgage payments and facing potential bankruptcy. His resentment toward anyone who appeared more successful than him had apparently manifested in his abuse of police power. But the most important discovery came when Hayes tracked down Officer Lisa Chen, Morrison's partner, on the day of David's traffic stop. Chen had left the Atlanta Police Department 6 months after the incident, citing concerns about department culture and accountability. When Hayes contacted Chen at her new job with the Georgia State Patrol, she was initially reluctant to discuss Morrison or the traffic stop. But when Hayes explained the evidence he had uncovered and the pattern of misconduct he had documented, Chen agreed to meet with him. "I've been losing sleep over this for months," Chen told Hayes during their meeting. "I knew Morrison was lying about what happened that day, but I was afraid to speak up. I was new, and I didn't think anyone would believe me over a senior officer." Chen provided Hayes with a detailed written statement describing what she had actually observed during David's traffic stop. Her account completely corroborated David's version of events and directly contradicted Morrison's testimony in almost every detail. Morrison has been bragging to other officers about how easy it is to get convictions against certain types of defendants, Chen revealed. He said judges always believe cops over criminals, and most people are too scared or poor to fight back effectively. Chen also revealed that Morrison had coached her on what to say if she was ever questioned about any of his traffic stops. He had told her that loyalty to fellow officers was more important than absolute accuracy in reports, and that small embellishments were acceptable if they helped convict people who were probably guilty of something anyway. Hayes realized that Chen's testimony would be devastating to Morrison's credibility, but he wanted to build an even stronger case. He hired a private investigator to track down other victims of Morrison's misconduct, and the results exceeded his expectations. The investigator found 12 additional cases where Morrison's reports appeared to contain false or exaggerated claims. 3 of these cases involved people who had been unable to afford good legal representation and had pleaded guilty to charges they insisted they didn't deserve. 2 others had resulted in convictions that were later overturned on appeal when evidence emerged contradicting Morrison's testimony. Most shocking of all, the investigator discovered that Morrison had been falsifying overtime reports for years, claiming to work hours he had never actually worked. The financial fraud investigation revealed that Morrison had stolen thousands of dollars from taxpayers through his false timesheets. Hayes arranged for all of this evidence to be presented to the district attorney's office in a comprehensive package that left no doubt about Morrison's pattern of misconduct and perjury. The DA, faced with overwhelming evidence of police corruption, had no choice but to launch a full criminal investigation. When David saw all the evidence that Hayes had assembled, he felt a mixture of vindication and outrage. The vindication came from knowing that his version of events was about to be completely proven. The outrage came from realizing how many other innocent people had been victimized by Morrison's lies. "How many people do you think he's done this to?" David asked. Hayes shook his head grimly. "Based on what we found, probably dozens, maybe hundreds over the course of his career." David stood up and walked to the window of Hayes's office, looking out at the city where he had served his country and been betrayed by someone sworn to protect and serve. But now he knew that justice was finally within reach. "Morrison picked the wrong person to mess with," David said quietly. "He thought I would just roll over and accept his lies. He had no idea who he was dealing with." Hayes nodded. "Morrison's career is over. His freedom is probably over too, and every case he's ever been involved in is going to be reviewed." The truth had finally been revealed, and it was more damning than either of them had imagined possible. Morrison's web of lies was about to collapse completely, and the consequences would reach far beyond just one corrupt officer. The Atlanta courthouse had never seen anything quite like the scene that unfolded on the morning when Officer Rick Morrison was scheduled to be arraigned on federal charges. News vans lined the street outside, reporters jostled for position on the courthouse steps, and a crowd of people who had been victimized by Morrison's lies gathered to witness what they hoped would be justice finally served. David Thompson stood among them. No longer the solitary defendant fighting a system that seemed stacked against him, he was now surrounded by a growing community of people who had suffered similar injustices and were determined to see meaningful change come from their shared experiences. The charges against Morrison read like a catalog of corruption: perjury, filing false police reports, civil rights violations, fraud, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights. Each charge carried significant prison time, and the federal prosecutors had made it clear they intended to seek the maximum penalties allowed by law. District Attorney Rebecca Foster had called a press conference the day before to announce the charges and explain how the investigation had uncovered what she called a pattern of systematic abuse of police power that strikes at the heart of our justice system. Officer Morrison violated his oath, betrayed the public trust, and used his badge as a weapon against innocent citizens, Foster had told the assembled reporters. The evidence against him is overwhelming, and we will prosecute this case to the fullest extent of the law. The investigation that had started with David's traffic stop had quickly expanded far beyond anyone's initial expectations. A special task force had been created to review every case Morrison had been involved in during his 18-year career, and the results were staggering. Investigators had identified 47 cases where Morrison's reports contained false or misleading information. 23 people had been wrongfully convicted based primarily on Morrison's fabricated testimony. Dozens of others had pleaded guilty to charges they didn't deserve because they couldn't afford to fight a system that seemed designed to crush them. The financial impact was equally shocking. Morrison had fraudulently claimed over $100,000 in overtime pay for hours he had never worked. His false arrests and wrongful convictions had cost the city millions in legal settlements and court costs. But the human cost was what really drove home the magnitude of Morrison's crimes. David had met with several of Morrison's other victims, and their stories were heartbreaking. A single mother who had lost her job after being arrested on false charges, a college student whose dreams of becoming a teacher were derailed by a criminal record based on Morrison's lies, an elderly man who had spent 3 months in jail awaiting trial for crimes he didn't commit. Officer Lisa Chen had become a key witness for the prosecution, and her decision to come forward had sparked a broader conversation about police accountability and the culture of silence that allowed corruption to flourish. Chen testified before a grand jury about Morrison's pattern of misconduct and the pressure she had felt to support his false reports. "I knew what Morrison was doing was wrong," Chen told the grand jury, "but I was afraid that speaking up would end my career before it even started. I realize now that staying silent made me part of the problem." Chen's testimony led to the discovery of other officers who had witnessed Morrison's misconduct but had remained silent. Several of them were now facing disciplinary action or criminal charges for their failure to report what they had seen. The Atlanta Police Department had been forced to implement sweeping reforms in response to the scandal. All officers were now required to undergo additional training on civil rights and ethical conduct. New oversight mechanisms were put in place to investigate complaints more thoroughly. Most importantly, a new policy was established requiring officers to report misconduct by their colleagues, with severe penalties for those who failed to do so. Mayor Thomas Richardson had personally apologized to David and the other victims of Morrison's crimes, calling the scandal a stain on our city that we must work together to remove. The city had already agreed to pay substantial settlements to several of Morrison's victims, and more lawsuits were expected. David's own federal civil rights lawsuit against Morrison and the police department was moving forward rapidly. His attorney, Robert Hayes, had built an ironclad case that was expected to result in a significant financial settlement. But for David, the money was less important than the precedent the case was setting. "This isn't about getting rich," David told reporters outside the courthouse. "This is about making sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." Morrison abused his power because he thought he could get away with it. We're here to prove that no one is above the law. David had used his growing platform to advocate for broader police reforms and accountability measures. He had testified before the state legislature about the need for better oversight of law enforcement. And he had spoken at community meetings about citizens' rights during police encounters. The Navy had also taken notice of David's case, and his commanding officers had commended him for his courage in fighting back against injustice. His security clearance had been fully restored, and he had been promoted to commander, recognizing both his military service and his contribution to civil rights. On the day of Morrison's sentencing, the courthouse was packed with victims, supporters, and members of the media. Morrison himself looked like a broken man as he sat at the defendant's table, his police pension gone, his reputation destroyed, and his freedom about to be taken away. Judge Maria Santos had reviewed all the evidence carefully before imposing sentence. Morrison had eventually pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a recommendation of 25 years in federal prison. The judge accepted the plea agreement but made it clear that she would have imposed an even harsher sentence if the case had gone to trial. Mr. Morrison, you have violated the most sacred trust that exists between law enforcement and the communities they serve, Judge Santos said as she looked down at the former officer. You used your badge not to protect and serve, but to intimidate and oppress. You turned the justice system into a weapon against innocent people, and you showed no remorse until you were caught. Morrison was led away in handcuffs, his 18-year law enforcement career ending in disgrace and imprisonment. But his downfall was just the beginning of a larger transformation in how police accountability was handled in Atlanta and beyond. David had established the Justice Accountability Foundation with his settlement money, providing legal assistance to people who couldn't afford to fight false charges or police misconduct. The foundation had already helped dozens of people clear their records and seek justice for wrongful arrests and convictions. Morrison thought he picked an easy target. David reflected as he watched the former officer being taken away. He saw a black man in an expensive car and assumed I wouldn't have the resources or the courage to fight back. He was wrong on both counts. The case had also sparked a broader national conversation about racial profiling and police accountability. David had been invited to speak at conferences and universities about his experience, and his story had become a symbol of how ordinary citizens could fight back against corruption and win. Officer Chen had found her voice as well, becoming an advocate for police reform and speaking regularly about the importance of officers reporting misconduct by their colleagues. She had been promoted to detective with the Georgia State Patrol and was working to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. The Morrison case showed us that staying silent in the face of corruption makes you complicit in that corruption, Chen told a gathering of police officers at a training seminar. We have a duty to protect people from criminals, even when those criminals wear badges. As David left the courthouse after Morrison's sentencing, he reflected on the long journey from that day when he was pulled over for crimes he didn't commit to this moment of justice finally being served. It had taken almost 2 years of fighting, but the truth had finally prevailed. The reforms that had been implemented as a result of the case were already showing results. Complaints against police officers were being investigated more thoroughly. Officers were being held accountable for their actions, and citizens were feeling more confident about their rights and their ability to seek justice when those rights were violated. David knew that the fight for justice was never really over, but this victory had proven that the system could work when people had the courage to demand accountability. Morrison's lies had been exposed, his victims had been vindicated, and the cause of justice had been strengthened. Most importantly, David had kept the promise he made to himself on that day when he was first pulled over. He had not let the injustice stand unchallenged. He had fought back with everything he had, and he had won. Justice had been served, and the system was stronger because of it.